Central thing, but it's been great to move out into the core and share programs with our community branches. I want to thank Sherry Garcia, the branch manager here at McClatchy, to make that a reality. Great colleague, does a great job. And so today's program, Mata Hari and her sisters, Carrie Sessarego is a tour de force. Great speaker. Last year she did a talk on the birth of sci-fi fantasy as a result of the First World War and really hit it out of the ballpark. The National World War I Museum in Kansas City wanted a copy of it, and they got it. Word traveled fast. Carrie is highly involved with the library, the Friends group. She is a scholar. She's a writer, particularly focusing in on 19th century English literature, gender topics. She is an Austin person all the way. Am I right there?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Okay, cool. So, but in addition to that, she's an activist, and she's just a great contributor to the community and to World War I Revisited. And you're on, kid.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
So if you need to interrupt, or just give me the high sign and we'll pause. So I have already been asked several times if I wrote a book called Mata Hari and Her Sisters. I did not. I just read a lot of books so that I could tell you about them. I also am really intimidated when I do these World War I things because I am not a military historian. I know very, very little about the military history of World War I. I know like the basics that I think most people who have a passing interest in history and literature probably know. It was muddy and it really was like totally awful. But if you know, when I did my presentation on sci-fi fantasy, I had to talk about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who were both involved in the Battle of the Somme. And I could tell you lots and lots about Lewis and Tolkien, but all I could tell you about the actual Battle of the Somme is that it was really sucky and you did not want to be involved in the Battle of the Somme. I could not find it on a map if my life depended on it. So, not a military historian, but I am very interested in women's history. And one of the things that usually happens in any war is that women start to fill roles that are customarily thought of as men's roles. And you see this in World War I, you see it with World War II. And women were very, very involved in espionage in World War I, which was a time when espionage as a huge organized endeavor was pretty new. That is not the last time I'm going to hit this with my elbow. I just know it because I like to talk with my hands. So when I decided how to organize this, I thought about it a lot in terms of propaganda. World War I was a big propaganda war. And women are portrayed who worked in espionage in three ways. There's the forgotten women who did most of the work. Most espionage is super, super boring. Most espionage is files, translating, paperwork, code breaking, cryptography. It happens in offices that are crowded and underfunded, and you don't get paid very well, and nobody remembers you later. But it is absolutely essential. No glamour at all. The femme fatale, of course. World War I propaganda was really into the femme fatale. And the femme fatale, of course, is most famously epitomized in World War I by Mata Hari, who we're going to discuss. I also, not to offend anybody with some fairly crass language, thought about categorizing these as the Madonna. The angel is the Madonna, and the femme fatale as the whole. Tropes in literature are familiar with the dichotomy that we often place women in between the Madonna and the whore. In propaganda, women tended to be placed in one of these two categories, and we all know where poor Mata Hari went. And here's, on the other hand, the martyrdom of Nurse Cavell. Tell my friends, I gave my life willingly for my country. I am super team Edith Cavell, who we're also going to talk about. However, propaganda didn't treat her very well in some ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the paperwork spies. And this, okay. All right, so of course the spy game has been going on forever, but World War I was the first time that there was a large British intelligence bureaucracy. One of my sources focused a lot on British intelligence, and as a result, I'm going to focus a lot on British intelligence, but this was also fairly true in the U.S. Now, in the U.S., there's a little bit of a difference in that the U.S. had the Civil War, and I would love someday to do a presentation on women spies in the Civil War, because both sides had women spies doing all kinds of crazy things. They had those big hoop skirts, and the Confederate women used to take guns and swords and loop them through the metal hoops and then put their skirts down and just deliver them by walking around that way. And they would take, they had those crazy hairstyles. They would write messages and fold them up really small and stick them in their hair and walk around like that. So the U.S. had been doing this for a while, but British intelligence, this was the first time you see a big, big group, and mostly I'm going to talk about MI5. Again, I am not a military historian, so if you ask me any question about British intelligence that isn't about women, I'm going to say, I don't know. I don't know. I'm very, specialized. One of the things that makes me a little unusual is usually when you want a speaker, you find someone who's an expert on the topic and you ask them to talk about it. But I am such a nerd that I hunt James down every year and say, what should I become an expert in this year? The only downside to that is, again, very narrow focus. I apologize, I'm not going to be able to answer a lot of questions generally about military intelligence. However, handy dates. The British Secret Service Bureau, created in 1909, and by 1919, over 6,000 women worked for British intelligence. Meanwhile, in America, hundreds of women worked in intelligence. Most of their work focused on cryptography, and that remained true all the way through the Cold War for American women. Quick trivia about World War II, Julia Child worked for the Secret Service, yes. And she worked as essentially as a file clerk in Sri Lanka, and that's where she met her husband. She also developed a kind of shark repellent that was used by the Navy, and her husband used to tease her that that was her first attempt at cooking. But that's the wrong war. But you can see that pattern of when there's a war, right, the men go off and do this thing, and now there's all this work that has to be done, and somebody has to do it. So suddenly it becomes legit for women to leave the home, enter the workplace, and start doing this incredibly essential work. And I just put this up for fun. This was included in one of my resource books, which, by the way, you all have on your handout. This was included in Female Intelligence, which is just a great resource. And I just thought it was cute. It's a parody that one of the office workers wrote of a Rudyard Kipling song. Let us now praise women clerks, clerks of little showing. For their work continueth, and their work continueth broad, and he continueth greater than their knowing. It was tedious work. Women worked very, very long hours. They often worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And surprise, after the war, most of them lost their jobs. And if they stayed, they faced an enormous amount of stigma for taking a job away from a man. They also were paid significantly less than men who did the same work. That included cost of life benefits, and it included bonuses for work well done. There were a few women, particularly in the upper levels, who were recognized by the government after their service was over, but most were not. So then we move on to the angel Edith Cavell. All right, so I'm going to pause for just a second and ask if anybody we'll do questions at the end, but I want to pause and kind of catch my breath and ask if anyone has a question about women that did that kind of work. Number one, yes.
You know the mystery series about woman code-breakers in Britain after the war?
Is that the Bletchley Circle?
Right, yes.
And that's World War II, right?
No, World War I.
Oh, World War I.
Yeah.
Ooh.
You can tell by the dress.
I will have to check that out. I have heard of that, but I confused my wars. Said various specialized knowledge. Yes.
Do you know what age spectrum of women worked in the intelligence services?
It was pretty broad. Apparently most were in their 20s or 30s, but it varied. Oh, one fun fact I forgot to tell you guys is you know about the Boy Scouts. Well, in Britain, the Girl Scouts were called the Girl Guides, and they worked as messengers between offices and within offices. And there was a lot of hilarity because they were like so keen to serve, and if they didn't have messages to do, they didn't have anything to do. So there are a lot of cartoons, satirical political cartoons, of them lined up outside doors waiting to have a message. And fun fact, the intelligence service tried using Boy Scouts first, but they found that the boys were too disruptive when there wasn't anything to do. And the girls were disruptive in more acceptable ways. I have a daughter who's a tween, so I can only imagine what that involved. But yes, they were very pivotal in the war effort. And of course, they were younger. They were mostly young teens. Yes?
For the women who were working during World War I, did they know the secrecy of their work? I'm just wondering, were they under any kind of oath to not talk about their work outside the office?
Yes. It depended, of course, on the job. So if you were a Girl Guide running a message from one office to another, you would know that you were handling sensitive material. There were rules, you couldn't just hand it to any old person. There were very strict rules, but you would have no idea what was in the message. On the other hand, a lot of women were handling extremely sensitive state intelligence. So it really depended on what you were doing. But anyone working for British intelligence had to take, oaths and follow certain protocols, which was part of what made it so frustrating, that their work went so unrewarded, and that they were often patronized, even though they were entrusted with serious, life or death material. Okay, shall we move to Edith Cavell, and we'll do some more questions at the end too. So I'm going to concentrate a lot on Edith Cavell and Mata Hari in contrast to each other. And then at the end, I'm just going to kind of throw out some more names to talk about people. Edith Cavell was a nurse. She was well educated. At that time, there were few jobs open to women. This was right before World War I broke out. She worked as a governess for a while, and she decided she wanted to change and she would try nursing. This was the first time that nursing was a respectable profession for a genteel woman in the UK. And that was largely due to the efforts of Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War, who had really, really pushed to make nursing a respectable profession. So Edith Cavell went through very, very rigorous training. By the time she completed years and years of training, She could do everything from take care of a newborn baby to prepare a dead body for burial. Her work was very extensive. And she found nursing to truly be a calling. She loved it and she felt very passionately about it. So she moved to Belgium when she was asked to open a nursing school in Belgium. And she faced a lot of challenges in Belgium. The building was not conducive to her work, and the message that nursing was respectable hadn't really hit Belgium as much as it had hit Britain. So she had a hard time getting students. But over the course of several years, she got things kind of leveled out, and she had, a really good functioning school. She was not very popular with her students because she was super, super strict. She was kind of a pain. She was intensely private, and we don't know much about her. There's no hint of her ever having been in love or wanting to get married. If she did, she kept that to herself. She didn't write about it in journals or in letters. She was like laser focused on nursing. However, everybody who worked with her, whether they liked her or not, seemed to agree that she ran a tight ship and she did a good job. So she was visiting her mother in England when the war broke out, and she went back to Belgium to prepare the school because they thought they might get influxes of wounded. Of course, Belgium became invaded by the Germans, and she became part of a network that smuggled Allied soldiers out of Belgium back into Allied territory. She was eventually caught, someone informed on her, and she knew for a long time that this was probably going to happen. The network was kind of a mess in the sense that it was really, really difficult to keep all these comings and goings secret. So everybody involved in the network knew that it would not go undetected for very long. She's estimated to have saved hundreds of lives getting people out. When the Germans imprisoned her, they convicted her of treason, even though she was a German, and they convicted her of espionage. Some of the other people in her network were involved in espionage in the sense of transmitting information across enemy lines. It is doubtful that Edith Cavell did that directly, although one assumes that any Allied soldier who got over the lines would talk about anything that he saw. She doesn't seem to have been directly involved in espionage. However, she was super, 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 super guilty of smuggling Allied soldiers out of Belgium. And she was executed by firing squad in 1915. This was incredibly shocking to Britain and to the US. It also fit quite conveniently with the narrative of the rape of Belgium. The idea that the Germans were brutal oppressors who wreaked havoc everywhere they went. So in propaganda, she was portrayed as both motherly and virginal. She was portrayed as a helpless victim of German brutality. And the draft hadn't kicked in yet, so most of the propaganda was focused on trying to recruit soldiers. For example, a Canadian poster urges people to enlist and help stop such atrocities. In Britain, recruitment numbers rose from 5,000 to 10,000 a week immediately following her death. The Germans were sort of nonplussed by this, by the way. They were like, wait, she totally smuggled soldiers out of Belgium, she did know you're not supposed to do that. And that did not fly with the Allies. They were horrified. When I talk about Edith Cavell and propaganda, I may sound like I don't admire her. I admire her deeply, but I don't admire the propaganda. And the reason is that the propaganda around Edith Cavell tended to strip her of agency. The propaganda around Edith Cavell depended on her being an angelic, helpless victim. And what happened to her was horrible, but it was the result of deliberate, heroic choice. She knew the probable consequences. It was surprising that she was executed. She believed that she would be imprisoned, and most people also believed that. Like, she knew she was going to be caught and that bad things would happen. And she made a very deliberate choice, and that very deliberate choice saved lots of people. And a lot of that aspect of her choice was very much taken away in images like this. It was the idea that a story went around that she wore her nurse's uniform to her execution, which was not true, that she fainted and was shot in the head. She's just kind of this example of the woman victim of brutality. And in real life, she was a tough cookie. She got stuff done. These are her dogs. I'm going to tell a little story about her dog lovers. Right? Yeah, well, you were before your dog ate your glasses.
True story.
Yes,
She really did
true
eat
story.
them. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so this dog didn't stay with her very long. She adopted this dog, and it only lasted about a year, and then it disappeared. But this dog, Jack, she adopted Jack, and she adored Jack, and Jack adored her. But Jack hated everybody who was not Edith Cavell. And Jack stayed with her all the time. So she walked around the hospital with the dog. She walked around the school with the dog. And the dog would growl at anyone who approached her. And the nurses hated him. Not because they were dog haters in general. I have to admit, I'm not sure I would have taken to Jack myself. At the end of meals, they said a prayer, and then the nurses had to stand up, and then they had to file up the stairs down the hall to their rooms. Well, nobody knows what breed of dog Jack was, but apparently he was part some kind of herding dog mix. And he would chase the nurses up the stairs, and he would nip them on the back of their ankles if they didn't go fast enough. All right, that's not cute. Jack, come on. But she adored him. I read a biography, and part of why I think that the story about Jack is so important is that Edith Cavell was so private that we don't know anything about her as a person. But she was more than a person who was a helpless victim of circumstance. She was a person who made choices. She was a person who got stuff done and was really strict and kind of mean, but she saved this dog. When she died, they tried to keep the dog at the nursing hospital out of respect, and it was impossible. They had to chain him up in the backyard and howl all the time. Some other people who had worked with her said, well, we have the chateau out in the country and we'll take him. Well, the very first thing he did was bite his new owner and the kennel master of the chateau. But they overlooked that. They just bandaged that up. And they worked with him for months and months and months. And finally, they won him over, and he had a nice, happy, long life. So I know that there is a small but passionate subset who will only care about the fate of the dog. I am with you. This is all I care about. The dog was fine. So going back to Belgium, there was the British started an organization, and one of the things I neglected to do before this presentation was practice pronunciation. And so this is not going to be pretty. Do we have any French speakers? La Dame Blanche. Okay, so this was an organization that the British started up by which anybody in Belgium could take an oath. And if they took that oath, they were considered part of the British military. That gave people a certain amount of protection. It gave men who were stuck in Belgium the sense that they were not chauffeurs, that they were contributing to the war effort, even though they couldn't get into the military because they were trapped. And it gave women quite a bit of protection. One of the things that the book Female Intelligence talks about quite a bit is the fact that a woman in occupied territory faces some very, very difficult issues in terms of sexuality. And being recognized as part of a military service gave women a little bit of protection, and it also gave them a huge sense of purpose. People were crazy about this. Most of this intelligence network concentrated on tracking train movements. And what that meant was you would have sometimes a whole family that would work together and would take shifts, watching and recording the movements of trains. How big the train was, how fast was it going, could they tell what was on it, any identifying markings, anything they could glean about this train. And they would work in shifts so that somebody was watching 24/7. Up to 30% of the members were women. And again, most of them were forgotten, particularly if they were really good and they never got caught. After the war, they had a heck of a time being recognized by the British military, because the British military suddenly decided that maybe it wasn't cool to have women in the military, but they had already been in, so eventually they had to be recognized. If we have time at the end, and I'm pretty sure that we will, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the members of Dame Blanche. And before I get on to Mata Hari, does anybody have any questions about this organization or about Edith Cavell?
I have a question.
Yes.
Why was nursing not considered acceptable, and who did it?
Well, in the Victorian time and previous to the Victorian time, so that's the time of the Crimean War and Florence Nightingale's efforts, nursing was considered the lowest possible profession. You went to the hospital basically to die, and nurses were often considered to be not any better than prostitutes. A lot of times nursing and prostitution was synonymous in language, if not in fact. Nurses were thought of as often drunk. It was like the lowest job, other than streetwalker, that you could have. When Florence Nightingale got involved in the Crimean War, she took it on herself to sort of revamp the image of nursing. And the emphasis of nursing schools tended to be on, they didn't really have germ theory, but they had some other ideas that worked fairly well even if you didn't know why they worked. So cleanliness, hygiene, nurses spent a ton of time cleaning. Looking presentable. Every nurse wore a uniform. Every school had a different uniform, so everybody knew where you came from, and your uniform was to be changed several times a day and laundered regularly, and having exemplary moral behavior on and off the job to try to convey the idea that a nurse could be sort of a woman of virtue as opposed to a slovenly woman. Florence Nightingale rather famously said every woman is a nurse, which made sense if you consider that women in the home, right, like we still do this, we've all poured Tylenol down our kids and cleaned up barf, and you know, like women do that all the time anyway. She tried to make that sort of an extinction, not so much of a radical feminist idea that women should be on equal footing with men, but more on an idea that women had certain moral virtues and inherent virtues of caregiving that would naturally suit them to make this a sainted profession. Excuse me. Anybody else? No? Okay. Yeah.
How long did the Dame Blanche service ran? How long did it continue?
I think it continued right up till the liberation of Belgium, and then it stopped. Yeah, it was only during the occupied years. It also went on in northern France, which was occupied, and I believe Luxembourg. And I'm not sure what year it began. I think it started up soon after the occupation, but it wasn't in place beforehand. Okay, so who's here from Mata Hari? Yeah. Oh, Mata Hari. Just look, she has like all her clothes on. I'm so excited for her. This is one of a picture from towards the end of her life. She lived up until I think her early 40s. I wrote it down later. Let's see. All right, so every superhero needs an origin story. Mata Hari has an origin story. And I'm going to pronounce pretty much every single word incorrectly. Mata Hari was born in Holland in 1876, and names were very important in her life. Her birth name was Margaretha Gertrude Zell, If anybody knows Dutch, you can tell me how to actually say that. Her father, spoiled or rotten until he fell in love with another woman, left his wife, and never really talked to her again. She was in boarding school for briefly, and she was expelled for having an affair with a teacher. She was 15 and he was about 60, and there's absolutely no question that today that would be considered statutory rape and obviously abuse of a position of power. But in the day, she was sent home in shame, and he stayed in the school for decades after and retired with all kinds of honors. So, her family, once her father took off, did not think very highly of her. She married quite young. She married a soldier named Rudolph McCloyd, and he was a soldier in the Dutch East Indies, where colonialism was in full nasty, nasty, nasty swing. It was not pretty. They were miserable together. Apparently, they were very passionate for about 5 minutes, and then the fighting started. They had 2 children together, one of whom died mysteriously. The question of how this child died rages on to this day. Many people, including the author of the biography, can you tell me on the reading list, what's the name of the biography? I wrote it down.
Dame
Because
Patel.
I had a brain. Thank you, Dame Patel. Love Lies and the Unknown Life of Mata Hari. That author, Pat Shipman, makes a pretty good case for the idea that Rudolph McCloyd, who had already been very sexually active before his marriage, had syphilis and transmitted it to her and to the children. And that one child died of botched syphilis treatment, and the other child lived into her 20s and then died very suddenly from a syphilis-related problem. There are different kinds of syphilis, and I'm not an expert on them, but one kind is inheritable and can also be dormant for a very, very long time. So, they were miserable. He was super, super jealous. Eventually, she said that she gave him cause to be jealous, but it sounds like before she gave him cause, he was already extremely possessive and jealous. He was quite a bit older than her, and he abused her in public and in private. They talked a lot about divorce, but they couldn't agree about money. Everything was awful, but finally, she got out. She left, and the price for her leaving was she had to leave her daughter. He got her daughter, and she did not see her daughter again. She made several attempts to reunite with her daughter, but she was never able to do so because of her scandalous reputation. I love this quote from her that she gave to an interviewer who said, well, why did you go to Paris? And she says, I thought all women who ran away from their husbands moved to Paris. And here she reinvents herself. So she was Margaretha to her family. When her husband was fond of her, he called her Imgreet, M''Greet. And now she invented a whole new side of herself. She was now Lady Gresham McLeod. Lady Gresham McLeod was the widow of a Scottish officer, conveniently dead. And Lady Gresham McLeod had studied and learned the ancient sacred dances of Java. If anyone is familiar with the term cultural appropriation, she was like all over that. She was appropriating like that. And in the sacred temple dances of Java, as interpreted by Mata Hari, you created this very sensual mood around you, and you danced to very sensual music. She was not highly trained as a dancer, but she was apparently very talented, and she had these beautiful, graceful movements, and she would, gradually remove her clothing. And depending on the performance, sometimes she ended up in nothing at all, and sometimes she ended up with a little on. But one thing she talked about that I always thought was funny is that she and her husband used to fight about how much of her décolleté, how much of her bosom she could reveal when she dressed for a dance or for a fancy dinner. And she found that the more of her bosom she revealed, the more the world just opened up for her. With every veil I threw off my success rose, pretending to consider my dances very artistic and full of character, thus praising my art, they came to see nudity, and that is still the case, she said. If you go online, not that you would for any period purposes, you can see all of Mata Hari you would possibly wish to see. One of the things I'm fond of with Mata Hari is that Mata Hari, as she got older, struggled with her weight. And there are several pictures of her where her tummy is kind of hanging out. And I just love that because our society is so obsessed with like the idea that women can't have a tummy. And she's like, I'm gorgeous, just deal. So there was a period known as the Belle Epoque in Europe. And it was a period that was very interested in Orientalism. It was very interested in the idea of a bohemian artistic class that was exempt from normal social rules. And that period of time was like custom made for her. She said at one point, I wanted to live like a butterfly in the sun. And for a period of about 10 years or so, she pulled it off. It was a perfect place and a perfect time for someone like Mata Hari. And then World War I hit, and it was not so great. She was having a much harder time making money, but she could travel all throughout Europe because of her status as an entertainer. Also because at that particular time, her home country was neutral. So, okay, at this point, everything from this bullet point on becomes intensely confusing. If you decide to research Mata Hari online and you go to 5 different websites, you will find 5 different interpretations of everything that happened between the onset of World War I and her death. But this is kind of what seems to be the deal. She goes to Germany and the Germans confiscate all her stuff, and she is pissed because they took her furs and her jewelry and they did not pay her back. Well, then one of the Germans tried to recruit her to do espionage, and he paid her. She said, well, you have to pay me this much, and she took the money. Later she said, I never did any spying. I figured they owed me for my furs, and now I had it. This, by the way, may or may not be true, but it's entirely in character with all the rest of her life. It's totally plausible with the way she thought about the world, right? They screwed her over. She got them to pay her back, in a way. She's done. She goes back to France, and the French recruited her to spy for France. And she's kind of mad because they don't pay up front, but they promised they'll pay on delivery. And she did do some spying for France. In fact, the only documented, proven espionage she did was on behalf of France. And it wasn't that great. She was not really a spy for the ages. So, then there's this drama about telegrams, just don't eat it. And then the head of French intelligence, Georges Ledoux, who recruited her, accused her of being a double agent and a spy for Germany. Now, Georges Ledoux was later also convicted himself of being a double agent, and he seems to be kind of a creep, so we didn't know about that. So, and she had a crappy trial, much like Edith Cavell, who was on the other side, and she was executed at the age of 41. And that was it for Mata Hari, except that this legend, and again, the propaganda is always very different from the person, right? In propaganda, she's a master spy and the queen of seduction. And what do we know from Mata Hari, right, from the propaganda? One, we know as women do not step out of line. And we also know that men do not trust a sexy woman, no matter what. That was the big propaganda push. One of the things that was really tragic and awful that happened to Mata Hari is that she was interrogated by a man who was deeply, deeply conservative. He was also extremely racist, and she had very dark skin. I have not discovered whether in her parentage, in her ancestry, there was some mixed race ancestry, but she was known as being unusually dark-skinned for the time. If you look at photos of her, it's just a little olive skin, but it was a time when pale skin was much more in fashion, so she stood out. And he described her in very racist terms. And everything that she brought up in her defense, he took as a sign of guilt. She's like, well, of course I know lots of German officers. I have sex with them, consensually, and it's super happy. They leave me richer, I leave them super happy. By the way, all of her lovers lovers, like she was always super upfront about her love affairs. And her lovers seemed to have left happy. Right? They weren't like, oh God, she betrayed me with another man, because she was always like, here's the deal, right? I live like a butterfly in the sun. So he's like, well, a woman who has many lovers automatically must be a spy. Because you have no morals, a spy has no morals, ergo, you must be a spy. She's like, well, I travel all over the world because I'm a cosmopolitan. I'm an entertainer, and I go from place to place, and I always have. I've always loved to travel. And he's like, well, see, because you're a spy. So there was very little that she could say that he didn't see as evidence of guilt. The fact that in his mind, she was not a sexually liberated, cosmopolitan, worldly woman. She was, excuse me, I'm going to use a rude word, she was a slut. And so he figured, great, she's a spy. After the war, the prosecutor said there was not enough evidence to flog a cat. I always find this somewhat ironic because of the vilification of Mata Hari and the sainthood of Edith Cavell. Now, Edith Cavell was, in my opinion, absolutely morally justified in saving all those lives. She was a hero, but technically, she was super guilty. She did it. She really did smuggle all those men out of Belgium, and Mata Hari just like took her clothes off. It's still very controversial whether she delivered any intelligence to the Germans or not, but there's not much evidence of it. One of the things about Mata Hari's story is that it helped bolster xenophobia, which was already in pretty full swing. A lot of women in Allied Europe were deported just because of their country of origin. And this is her interrogator, Pierre Beauchardon. We must make clear that from our point of view, maintaining contact with the enemy, and remember, Mata Hari took lovers regardless of where they came from. From our point of view, maintaining contact with the enemy is considered legally to be a crime equivalent to actually furnishing information to the enemy. So women were, for instance, arrested because one woman was arrested because she had a brother in Germany and she sent him a letter. And it wasn't like an espionage letter, but she was in contact with the enemy. The other thing about Mata Hari's story that comes up sometimes is that a lot of people were really uneasy with this idea that women were taking roles often held by men, right? Edith Cavell took on a very powerful leadership job, but it fit a traditional narrative of a woman as the angel in the home, which was a Victorian idea that still comes up all the time. The idea that women are naturally nurturers. We are naturally caregivers. We are naturally motherly, right? So Edith Cavell wasn't really usurping the role of a man. But Mata Hari was breaking rules all over the place. Nobody cared if she really spied. She slept around. She danced with her clothes off. She went wherever she wanted to go. She lived life completely on her terms as a single woman. So her story kind of reminded women, don't go too far with this. All right? Y'all got to kind of stay in line at least a little, because when the war is over, you have to go back home. And we're going to cheat a little bit and jump over to World War II, because Josephine Baker was sort of the anti-Mata Hari. Is anyone familiar with Josephine Baker? She was an entertainer, and she was an entertainer in World War II. She was American, but she moved to France. And she was famous for dancing in her banana skirt, the banana skirt dance. The costume for the banana skirt dance was a banana skirt. If you thought that you were to go online, you can see all of Josephine Baker that you would like to see, with or without the banana skirt. So she was an exotic dancer. She was extraordinarily talented. She's amazing. I looked at some of the old videos of her. She's just amazing to watch. During World War II, just like Mata Hari, Josephine Baker was able to have a lot of freedom of movement because of her profession. And she used it to be an extremely successful spy for the French resistance. She used to smuggle documents in her sheet music. Sometimes she wrote it in invisible ink. on her sheet music. Sometimes she hid it in her underwear. And she was absolutely beloved by the French. So if you're ever curious about the idea of a Mata Hari who was successful, Josephine Baker is sort of out Mata Hari's Mata Hari. I also will say, before I go on to my conclusion, that if Mata Hari and Edith Cavell had met, I suspect they would have loathed each other. Okay, these two women had nothing in common, except one thing. And that one thing, I think, was very much erased by the propaganda around them. They were both women who envisioned a life that they wanted to lead. And they went after that life, and they got it. Mata Hari had a very distinct vision of the life she wanted. And it was a very unusual and unconventional life, but she got it for a long time. She made that work for a long time before she was killed. And Edith Cavell, while the life she chose was radically different, could not be more different from Mata Hari's, but she did not get married and have babies. She figured out what kind of life she wanted, and she went after it, and she got it. So my conclusion, and I'm just checking to see if we're doing that time. Okay, we have plenty of time. Oh, cool, because I have some other women I want to throw in. Is that women were indispensable, and this is Mata Hari. She did have, I have to say, her, I should have put more pictures in the slides. Her costumes were gorgeous. There may not have been much of them, but they were beautiful. Women were absolutely indispensable to World War I intelligence. In my research, I did not get as far as looking at the details of this, but also their involvement in World War I intelligence made a big difference in terms of World War II intelligence. Propaganda tended to turn women into either shameless villains or helpless martyrs, but in reality, and I should have typed this in, or forgot them altogether, right? In terms of our completely unglamorous paper workers. But in reality, women acted with a great deal of agency, and they wanted opportunities to contribute to the war effort. Well, okay, Mata Hari didn't. She just wanted to do her thing. But the women who were involved in Dame Blanche, Edith Cavell, the women who were involved in the offices of MI5, they desperately wanted to be part of the war effort, and they were very, very proud of the work that they did, and they should be. It was amazing. Absolutely indispensable. So before we go on to some bonus materials, does anybody have questions or comments about Mata Hari? No? Okay. She just speaks for herself. I should have put up the picture where her tummy, she took a lot of flack as she got older for her tummy, and they love it that she never covered it up. I'm just so proud of her. But yeah, she was a very complicated person. There is a story that she stripped in front of the firing squad. Tragically, that seems to be untrue. However, there was a priest who befriended her in the weeks before her execution, and they became very friendly. And she did blow him a very chaste, sweet little kiss as she was being let out. It's very sweet of her. Yes?
Are you saying then that the idea that Mata Hari was a spy, the facts of that are not terribly strong?
Right, yeah, well, she was a spy for France, which shot her.
Okay.
Right, but she wasn't a very good spy for France. And she didn't spy very much for France. And the evidence that she spied for Germany is very, very sketchy. Anybody else? Yes?
Did she have an opportunity to spend time with her daughter ever in her?
No, she never saw her daughter again after the divorce. She tried several times, but she wasn't able to. It's very, and a lot of why she stayed so long in that abusive setting was because she didn't want to lose her daughter. But after multiple death threats from her husband, she finally decided to leave. Yeah.
Carrie, have you seen any efforts either in the Netherlands, France, places where she spent time to sort of rehabilitate her as being, no? I mean, like any memorials or anything like that?
Well, I think that he shows up a lot as an intriguing figure. But it's not like, and partly this is because, you know, I'm not sure there's a definitive answer on what she did in the war. And as long as there's not absolute proof either way, France doesn't have to say, oh, hey, about that woman we shot, we're real sorry about that. So, you know, she's discussed a lot, she's talked about a lot. But I don't think there's like a move to make amends or anything like that, you know. And I think in the public eye, she's still very much the seductress. Interestingly, theoretically, we'll go on to some of our other women of note. I'm going to skip around a little bit. The Lady Doctor was a German spy in World War I, and she was never identified. She was called lots of names: the Tiger Woman, the Red Tiger, the Lady Doctor. And all these stories were told about the Lady Doctor, but she was never identified, and in fact, nobody's actually sure if she was a real person or if she was sort of this urban legend of World War I. And she was sort of described as a Matahari who was smarter and more calculated. She was described by people who claimed to have met her as being completely cold, nerves of steel, a ferocious intelligence, and a captivating sensuality that would lure any man. And that she smelled great. Also, that was like a big thing, right? The smell would waft from her décolleté and make men helpless before her powers, and they would tell her anything. And she ran this huge network of other cold, calculating women. And again, it kind of fit this sort of narrative of, you know, she was worldly, she was smart, she was capable, she acted through logic, not emotion, and she was sexually uninhibited. And there was a certain cautionary thing in the propaganda about the Lady Doctor, which was men, keep your mouth shut, no matter how great she smells, right? And women, stay in line. Right? There's a lot, I mean, it really freaked people out a little bit that women were doing all these jobs, even though there was a huge push to get women to do all these jobs. And that's very common in war. There's a lot of ambivalence about the role of women shipping. So the Lady Doctor was a chance for people to say, look, you can be a new woman up to a point, but don't go too far with it. Yeah. Oh, you're leaning. I thought you had
I'm leaning.
Yeah, and so she's never been identified. There's a couple contenders whose names come up, and they're not names that anybody really recognizes, but nobody knows who she was or if she was even real, but there were lots of stories about her. Some members of La Dame Blanche include Gabrielle, I'm going to say her name wrong. I'm tempted to just say it all wrong. Gabrielle Petit. She was known as Belgium's Joan of Arc. And she was a very passionate member of La Dame Blanche, and she was in her 20s. She's a baby. And she was very, very excited about the work that she did. She was thrilled to be a soldier. If you were in La Dame Blanche, you were considered a soldier, and that was for so many women absolutely thrilling. And she ran like a whole network, and she was involved in distributing newspapers and smuggling people out of the country. She got recruited because her fiancé was wounded, and she smuggled him out of the country. The British talked to her. They recruited her, and then she went back to Belgium and started spying. And again, she's another woman who became famous because she was executed by firing squad, and she made wonderful propaganda material because she was sort of the young girl virgin image. And she famously said, I will show them that a Belgian woman knows how to die, as she was being led out. These women, Princess Marie de Croix, whose mom, by the way, remember I told you about the dog? Her mom took the dog and rehabilitated him. Louise, whose last name I can't say, Comtesse Joan de Belle, they ran the escape network that Edith Cavell was part of. And one of the things that freaked people out about the Germans executing spies is it was kind of arbitrary. Because these three women were way more into espionage than Edith Cavell was. And they were not executed. She went to prison. Louise Flies went to prison. And I'm actually not sure. I think she also went to prison, but I think she stayed out. She was also very active in World War II intelligence. And then the Joan of Arc of the North, and you'll notice there's a certain theme here, propaganda-wise. Louise de Patel, she ran a network for the British out of northern France. And she died of illness in prison. And after the war, she was kind of discovered. And there's statues all over Belgium about her. And then an older woman, Elise Grandpress, she was interesting because she involved her entire family and a whole bunch of neighbors. Like half of her town was involved in her network of gathering intelligence. And this was quite common. And one thing the British found out was that they used to say, the woman is everything, the man is nothing. If you want to recruit a family, if you could get the matriarch of the family on your side, then the whole family would have to follow. Right? If the man was all for it, then the mom might fight it. And the kids might rebel. But if the mom said, oh, we're totally spying for British intelligence, so this is definitely on. And then the whole family would follow her, and half the time a whole bunch of neighbors would follow too. So there were a lot of mothers and grandmothers who were running huge networks, and everybody was in it. When she went to prison with her brother, her husband, I think another brother, like a whole bunch of them went. And she and her brother were both killed. And again, in the propaganda, she was it was like this woman and, oh yeah, like some guy. It very much focused on her. That also happened with Edith Cavell. A man who worked with Edith Cavell was executed at the same time that she was. And he was very little mentioned, even though, he had done good work. So, open it up to questions and comments about women in World War I. Yes?
Well, I have a general question about the legacy of World War I.
Yes.
It was misguided and a disaster for millions of individuals. But British and American women did realize the right to vote immediately after. Now, I'm assuming that with British women being put to work in men's roles, played some role in that, but are there other reasons?
I think that was huge. It was huge. It was a huge reason. And one of the things that happened with that, and also happened in America to a somewhat lesser extent, but still a really popular extent, was that even some of the more conservative politicians started saying, we expect women to serve the country in all the ways we expect a man to serve the country, so we should give them the vote. Their ability to do these jobs in a lot of ways sort of legitimized their efforts. Yeah.
Actually, that's why President Woodrow Wilson voted for the 19th Amendment. He said they earned their right to be citizens by their service during the war.
Yeah, it was really pivotal in both Britain and in the U.S. And this is not an area I know as much about. But if you want to fall down a Google rabbit hole, you can also look at the effects of World War I and World War II on the civil rights movement for African Americans, who had some similar issues in the sense that they were expected to fight for their country and die for their country, and then they came home and they couldn't get a cup of coffee. Josephine Baker, by the way, was a huge supporter of the civil rights movement and finally came back to America to participate in it. She gave a wonderful speech at the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. She was the only woman to give a full speech, and it's electrifying. You can find it online. It's wonderful. She's like, when I grew up in America, they used to call me a little devil. And you know what? I was a little devil. And I was a little devil here, and I was a little devil in France. And when I came back to America, I couldn't even get a cup of coffee, and that made me mad. And I started to talk about it, and when Josephine Baker talks, people listen. Which is amazing. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, that a pattern that we see, that we ask people to serve in certain ways, and by doing that, it makes their requests for equality, their demands for equality, seem more legitimate to people who had previously questioned them. Anybody else? Such a quiet group today. It's because the AC is like getting lower as there's more bodies in the room. You had one.
I was just curious about, Mata Hari was an exotic dancer, and everyone wanted to see her, and they were pretending it was art and so forth. Were there no other exotic dancers that were famous?
She was, I think, the star of the show, but one of her problems, actually, was that Isadora Duncan started doing some similar stuff, and Isadora Duncan had serious artistic chops. And so that her dancing career, Mata Hari's dancing career, was actually pretty short because it relied on novelty. And she saw Isadora Duncan as her arch rival. The other thing is that there wasn't like a patent on that kind of dancing, so other people started to copy her, and then she became less novel. And then she switched more, after a few years of dancing, she started switching more to being the mistress of various rich men, and she did some performances like on bequests and so forth. But a lot of the money fell off. She was kind of like a fad. And then, it was hard for her to keep it up for exactly that reason. Not only were there other exotic dancers, but there were other exotic dancers who started copying her thing.
Princess Marie, did she not get put in prison because she was a princess, or was that just a title she has?
She was princess. I assume that's why. I think she went to prison for a very brief time, but was let out pretty quickly, and because of her status with the royal family. The whole royal family was involved in various kinds of resistance. And by the way, one of the things that is so sad is that if you try to look up Princess Marie de Croix on Wikipedia, she doesn't have a Wikipedia page. My entire career depends on Wikipedia. So I would love to know more about her. I just think she seems like just a fascinating person. But there's not a ton about her. I believe she did write a memoir, though, after World War II. She was active in both World War I and World War II. Another person who's on your reading list that I did not mention, who was a member of Dame Blanche, by the way, was this Martha McKenna. She was a member of Dame Blanche in Belgium, and she wrote this memoir. Some people say it was ghostwritten by her husband. I don't know whether or not that's true, although I do know that when women write stuff, it's often claimed that a man must have written it, some kind of like, She writes about being a spy in Belgium and really struggling. And one of the things that's good about her memoir is that she writes about the moral complexities of her work. Also, Edith Cavell, I put these two books back on the back table. They have a lot of pictures. These were both very good. This was a very good biography, and this was, Edith Patel was the biography of Mata Hari, and it's very good. Female Intelligence is a really, really short book, but it's just crammed with information, and it's super, super readable. And I have it on the back table. For one thing, I wanted people to get a chance to look at it. Thank you, she's holding it up. Yay! I wanted people to have a chance to look at it, but also I figured if you asked me a question I didn't know the answer, I could be like, quick, someone look in the index. Because it's just got so much stuff in it. I didn't talk much about American women, but largely because they weren't doing much overseas. But this website, nwhm.org, has the names of some women who were particularly influential in the field of cryptology, code-breaking, which of course became so pivotal in World War I and also World War II right up through the Cold War. And many of them were able to stay in the service. questions, comments? Yes?
Today, women play a very important role with the CIA. A lot of people don't know it, but a lot of their agents are women who are pretty damn good at it, too.
Yeah.
I worked with a couple in Vietnam, and they very good.
Oh, really? Like, what kind of work did they do?
Well,
Or can you tell us?
I wouldn't say analysts, but they were, it's just like a diplomat. They knew a lot of people within the government, and they kept us informed about the Vietnamese government, which is not always that friendly.
Yeah. And one of the things about, when I talk about the women and the bureaucracy who work with paperwork, that's not a very helpful term, because paperwork could mean all kinds of things. So there were women who were translators. There were women who were, and a lot were recruited specifically to be translators. Pardon me. There were women who were writing up histories and doing research about the history of the different countries and different people and pulling stuff together. This is before Google. This was before the internet, and it was before computers. So every single file about every single person had to be filled out in triplicate and stored in these very specific ways. And if it got lost, disaster, right? So even being like a file clerk wasn't really so much like being a file clerk in like a modern office. It was a very, very challenging, rigorous job that a lot depended on. And then there were women doing all kinds of other documentation and writing stuff up.
In World War II, the person who found Peenemünde was a woman, a female aerial interpreter for the British.
Oh, cool.
And she identified what was there, and they got bombed the hell out of it.
Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting about World War II propaganda is that we hear more, in talking about the occupied territories, we hear more about people who fought in the resistance in World War II than people who fought in the resistance in World War I. And that's not necessarily because there were more of them. It's because the narrative that drove so much of the Allied movement in World War I involved the rape of Belgium. The idea that this is an uncivilized country that steamrolls other countries and violates their women and children, right? So it wasn't super helpful to have a lot of narrative of women in resistance. But if you get into World War II, you see incredible stories about women who were in occupied territories, women who were in the field, not to mention behind the lines. It's not an area that I'm super well versed in, but it's absolutely fascinating stuff. Yeah.
It's like saying a woman can do a better job than a man in an occupied territory.
What's that?
A woman can do a better job in an occupied territory.
I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think that there are certain, in a broad sense, but I think that there are circumstances in which women may have access and freedom of movement that men do not, and there are circumstances in which men may have advantages that women may not. For instance, men did not work as nurses. If you were a nurse in a hospital full of German soldiers, then you knew how many were coming in and what battle they had come from, right? That was useful to know. In terms of social structure, a lot of times women kind of ran the show. So if you wanted to recruit a whole family, it's not that you wanted to recruit the mom because moms were better at spying. It's that you wanted to recruit the mom because moms were better at convincing the whole family to go along with the plan in terms of how that particular societal structure worked. There was a belief that men might be more likely to trust another woman. And of course also there was simply the fact that there were more women around, right? Because where are the men? They're gone. They're at work for the most part. The ones who weren't were very, very happy to be recruited because they wanted to feel like they could contribute. But a lot of them were gone at the front. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay.